Test. Perfect. Good. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jervis, and I realize I'm the last session preventing you from lunch, so I'll try and make it quick. So yeah, my name's Jervis, and a little background on myself. I actually came from the mobile security side. I used to work at Citrix for a couple of years in the mobile device management and mobile application space. And as the cloud got really big, I kind of transitioned over here to Netscope, where I am currently on the product marketing team. And so today, I'm going to be talking about cloud security and kind of the trade-offs between, and not needing trade-offs between that and actual privacy for your employees. And so I'll first kind of set up the context in terms of the problems and kind of risks associated with the cloud, and then move on to the actual kind of requirements that we at Netscope like to kind of promote in terms of best practices for cloud security to enable your workforce while still keeping their privacy intact. So let's get started. So right now there are around 10,000 or more enterprise cloud apps today, and the number is rapidly growing. And in fact, at Netscope, we actually have a research team devoted entirely to cloud apps. And our number right now is around 22,000 in our database that we track for the cloud. And so all of these include not only, your typical Office 365 productivity suites, that also includes Box, Twitter, Salesforce. So these are apps that you and your employees use every single day to get their job done. And so with this proliferation of apps, what's the problem? And so the problem is 90% of these apps and more are not enterprise ready. So what we do is we actually go into customers, and the first step that we do with our customers is find out what apps they're actually using, what kind of cloud apps they're using and accessing. And when we walk into a large organization, that we usually ask, okay, so how many cloud apps do you think your employees are using? And the answer usually is around 40 to 50. So they'll talk about Salesforce because that's what they've procured for the employees. They'll talk about Office 365 or Google Apps for Work. They'll talk about Marketo. And so in their mind, they'll be like, oh, okay, so we have these apps that we've already sanctioned. And then I guess there might be a couple more that I'm missing. And they'll say, okay, so maybe 40 to 50 apps. But when we actually go in and do the discovery process to kind of find all the applications that are being used, the average number of apps that we've come up with is over 900 actual apps being used by employees. And so subtract that from 40 to 50, you have all the shadow IT apps that IT doesn't actually know employees are using and accessing and kind of sending sensitive data, sensitive corporate information into. And so IT is blind to pretty much 90% of that. And for even larger organizations that are global or have 100,000 more employees, a lot of times the app count can go into the thousands. So we actually have one that actually went over 2,000 apps in the company, and IT was completely unaware of that amount. And so with these apps, because I said earlier that we track all these apps and kind of determine kind of the security capabilities, etc. of these, we've noticed that 90% of these apps are not enterprise ready. And what that means is they might not encrypt data at rest or in transit. They might not have the necessary access controls in place. They don't have the data center certifications, etc. Through a variety of parameters, and you can determine that they're not actually enterprise ready. And so when IT is blind to that, that leads to problems for the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. That leads to problems for the CIO and even the CFO, where there are a lot of security concerns at risk. When a lot of your business data is stored within these apps and used and shared with these apps, you get a lot of risk when that's involved. And so this actually impacts a lot of people. So how do these apps actually get in? And so around 10% of what we call sanctioned apps, so your Box, your sanctioned cloud storage apps like Box, Workday, Concur, your expense apps, those are the ones that IT actually procures for the user, and we call those sanctioned. And those are the apps that went through all the auditing processes. You've done your due diligence on it, done your vendor assurance, and made sure those apps are secure. They have all the access controls in place, and they have everything that you want, including SLAs, etc. And then the rest of the apps are unsanctioned, obviously. And so 70% of those we like to say, are business-led. And so these include lines of business or specific teams, like your marketing team, like your sales team. And they'll be using things like Marketo, where they kind of just get it themselves to use for the business unit. GoToMeeting. All of these apps are provisioned by themselves for the team to use. And finally, the last 20% are user-led apps. And this includes Twitter, this includes LinkedIn, this includes ZippyShare, the storage apps that you kind of never heard of before, but your employees bring into the organization. They're used to using it, and they use it to remain productive. And so you can see 10% versus 90% that you don't really know or have control over and that you didn't procure is going to be a really big problem in terms of business risks and the sensitive information stored within them. So what is the risk here? Obviously, this isn't the end of the world because you want your employees to stay productive while maintaining security. And so at Netskope, we kind of divide the risks into 4 separate vectors. And so the first one are the apps. With more than 900 apps being used in a typical organization, you have no control over whether those apps are secure, whether they're enterprise ready, whether they actually have the appropriate controls that you want. And so they may not encrypt at rest, data at rest. They may not offer kind of auditing activity so you can see who's accessing what and who's editing what. Number 2 is the user. A lot of times it's not even malicious, because I don't know how many of you do this, but we're all lazy, right? And so a lot of times, especially with your passwords, you reuse them again across all your business apps, even from your personal ones. And so whenever there's a hack or there's like a data breach at one of these, the hackers actually have your credentials. And when you use it across business apps, that presents a really big risk because you're reusing credentials that are already out there and known to dangerous actors. The next one are the activities. Everybody works with third-party vendors. Everybody works throughout the company, and so they use cloud storage and sync apps like Box, and you upload sensitive information into them, and you share it. And that's a really easy activity to do. And you share it, and sometimes you just kind of share the link, and you don't even remember it. And so the link could be public to everyone. All this information is out there in the cloud already. And also, you have to think about the anomalies, too, which ties back to the compromised credentials. What happens when you do have a compromised credential that you're using, and so that account was hijacked? And so how do you kind of identify when, someone's logging into Salesforce from Germany as well as from Africa or something like that? How do you identify these anomalies and prevent them from happening? Finally, there's kind of the data. From our own research of our hundreds of customers who store files in the cloud, whether they be HR apps or cloud storage apps, etc., 18% of those files in the cloud constitute a policy violation. And so what this means is our customers have DLP policies set up. And so if you're trying to prevent protected health information, PHI, or PII, or PCI data in the cloud, we detect the violations, and we can see that people are uploading these files, and 22% of these files are shared publicly. And so these are public links that have not been restricted, which presents an even greater risk. And so when you have all 4 of these things acting together, it's kind of like a perfect storm, right? It's a user using an insecure app with compromised credentials, downloading, uploading sensitive information all over the place. What do? Well, we call this kind of the catch-22 of cloud app security, where you do want the user to be able to use all the apps that they want to use, and so that they can remain productive. But you also need, for compliance reasons, for security reasons, you need to secure that sensitive data, whether it's PHI, PII, source code even. And so that's kind of the catch-22 between it. And here at Netscope, we like to say allow is the new block, because at the end of the day, you can't block all these sites. You don't know what these sites are. Cloud apps are appearing every single day. You're not going to be able to keep track of all the cloud apps, so you can't block everything. And when you do block something, employees are just going to try and find a way around it. They're going to go off premises. They're going to use a mobile device to try and get access to these apps to remain productive. And in the end, even if you do try and block as many apps as possible, you're going to create exception sprawl when your executives want to use Twitter or some random app that they found that they really like. And so they're going to make you do that. And different business groups are going to come to you and say, why don't we have access to this? And this presents a really big problem, especially when you're dealing with third-party vendors. Even as a typical consumer, when I interact with my bank for a mortgage, I tried to send my files in a Box link to them, and they come back to me and they're like, oh, we can't use Box because it's prevented by IT. So what are you going to do? You're actually blocking business from happening. Your employees are not productive. And so there's this fine line that you walk on. And so our philosophy is, in terms of best practices, is not to block those apps, but to block the risky activities. Block it at the granular level where, if you have a user trying to upload PHI into Dropbox, you prevent that action from happening, the upload from happening, and actually send them a message and say, actually, we've standardized on Box, so you might want to use that instead. And that way, when they're collaborating with maybe like a design resource or an external vendor who uses Dropbox, they can still download those files, they can still collaborate with them. And so how does privacy come into play with this? You're kind of talking about monitoring a lot of the user activities in terms of when people are accessing the cloud and using cloud apps. At Netscope, we kind of go by this privacy by design framework. And so this was created by a person named Anne Cavoukian. Dr. Cavoukian was actually the privacy commissioner of Ontario in Canada, the former privacy commissioner, and she actually has a privacy by design framework that she worked out. We also have a white paper written on it, but I'm not going to bore you with the details, but you can read kind of the major tenets here on this slide. And what I want to kind of emphasize, instead of reading off the slide, is that the privacy by design framework emphasizes and focuses on inputting kind of privacy at the very beginning and throughout all your IT processes and all your IT solutions. So when you begin to kind of implement an IT process or a security solution, you have the privacy framework in mind so that you keep your users' privacies intact. And the second point that I wanted to make that's really important here that I like is the visibility and transparency part of it. And that's keeping your users informed of all your security policies, all the processes that you put in place, and all the documentation that you might put in place with regards to, specifically for this talk, cloud use. But this kind of applies to everything that you actually implement, right? And it's all about kind of coaching the user and letting them justify their actions and informing them of kind of your policies. So back to the earlier example of when I said, you can put a message out saying, don't use Dropbox, use Box, because that's the corporate sanctioned app that we use. You're kind of maintaining the transparency, and so the user will have a better user experience and will actually understand what's going on and kind of accept the security processes and security solutions that are being put in place for them, just because you justified it and you're kind of communicated to them, as opposed to being like, they go to a random financial app site and they're immediately blocked and they have no idea why. And then that obviously creates a headache for you when they come back to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so now I'm moving on to the kind of the meat of the presentation, which is kind of 7 requirements for mitigating cloud risk and all the while maintaining privacy. And so remember the kind of tenets that we just went over. With that in mind, we're going to kind of go into the requirements of what we would recommend as best practices to kick off your cloud security processes and initiatives at your organization. So requirement 1 is finding all the apps running in your environment and assessing enterprise readiness. When I go into a customer, one of the first things that we do is do an evaluation, do a risk assessment, a cloud risk assessment on what kind of apps are actually running in your environment. Because as I said before, a lot of your teams, your security teams, aren't going to know which apps are being used and accessed, and they're not going to know how safe they are. And so the first step in this process is finding all those apps, looking at, who's using what app, the usage, the users, how many people are using those apps, and seeing the actual enterprise readiness of those apps. Are those apps offering encryption? Are those apps SOC 1, SOC 2 compliant? Do they have the data center certifications that's necessary? Do those apps have access controls? Do they have audit activity trails? What can you do with those apps, and what information does those apps use from your users? So that's the first requirement. And kind of the privacy best practice of this, when keeping in mind the user privacy, is to bypass selected cloud apps. And this includes apps that your users kind of bring in and are using individually for kind of, personal purposes or everything else. So, you're going to have different versions of Box instances because you're going to have a personal Box instance that a user might be using just to send documents while at work to someone else and upload them. And then you're going to have your corporate sanctioned version of Box or Dropbox. And by differentiating between the two and actually only focusing in on the corporate sanctioned ones, you can maintain the user privacy and make sure that, you're not looking at the traffic that you don't really need to anyways, and that you don't kind of invade on the privacy of your employee. Requirement 2 is understand cloud usage details. And so what do I mean by that? As you can see, like Bob's credentials have been compromised, Bob in accounting. So you get all this user information from the cloud apps. And so when you're doing this discovery process, after you find all the apps and assess their kind of enterprise readiness in your environment, you find out what people are doing with the apps. Are they uploading PHI data into this business intelligence app? Are they downloading all the HR information from this HR app? Are they sharing it with external people? Are they sharing sensitive data with external people that they aren't supposed to be doing? All these details need to be understood so that you can kind of craft all your IT processes and policies around them. So when you realize that, it seems like a lot of people are accessing Office 365 webmail from the phone, you can kind of create policies based off of that. And so one example of that would be, say you see a lot of mobile usage of Outlook. What you can do is actually lock it down, because you don't want people, maybe there's a policy in place that you don't want people accessing sensitive corporate information, source code, etc., downloading that from email onto their personal devices. So what you can do is actually limit access. See if the mobile device that they're accessing the Outlook from is managed or not. If it's not a corporate managed device, then what you can actually do is just lock it down and maybe just give them access to Outlook web version, but not let them do any download activities onto the device so that they can still, look at their emails, etc. They can't do anything else about it. Whereas if they're on premises or using a corporate sanctioned device that's corporate issued, they can have full access to the application. And so once you understand the cloud usage details like that, you can kind of craft your policies in terms that are customized to your organization and in terms of your needs. And so the privacy best practice for this is to obfuscate the personal data in the UI and do it per role. And so this applies even on the admin side. You don't necessarily need to know who is doing what with the data. A lot of times that's kind of their business, right? And so, but you just need to understand the usage activity and to craft your policies. Unless there's like a major security incident or a major security breach, but then you just go back into the logs to find out who specifically did it. You can obfuscate the personal details so that everything remains private. So for requirement 3, it's use surgical precision in your policies and leverage contextual data. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about allow is the new block. And so this one here is making sure that you're kind of governing all the usage and access with a surgical precision. And so what you do is, as I said before in the use case about the mobile access to Outlook, you can make sure that you're using specific parameters, like based on device, or maybe for SOX compliance, you want to see, you want to track who's auditing and changing and deleting data. So when you do that, you can actually place policies to say, okay, maybe only the finance team can access this one app to edit information because nobody else should be able to. And so by placing those kind of surgically precise and granular policies, you make sure that you're not inhibiting any activity that helps employees remain productive while still kind of protecting your sensitive information. And so this contextual data that I'm talking about can be device, it can be user, so user identity in terms of user group, department, email, etc., as well as kind of location and network location, etc. And so the privacy best practice for this is differentiating between corporate and personal app usage. And so the example I have here is differentiating between the app instances. You don't do anything if it's a personal instance of Dropbox, but if it's a corporate instance of Dropbox, what you can do is actually set policies on that. And so in this one, I'm setting a policy on PII data and uploading it and preventing that from being done. And so that way, you don't have to do anything with in terms of the traffic of personal instances, and so the employee still keeps their privacy. Number 4 is enable right-sized admin privileges, and this is a big one. The example I give for this used to be Office 365, actually, where if you had admin privileges for one person, that was universal and global. So they'd have admin access for email, they'd have admin access for SharePoint, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They actually fixed this recently, but for our kind of example, this applies to all cloud apps because a lot of them haven't fixed that. And so you're not going to be able to have kind of the right-sized admin privileges. You're not going to have those silos that you need for admins. And this is especially important for people in kind of financial services industry, especially if you've gone through kind of a SOX audit, whether it's formal or informal, you're going to have this problem, right? You're going to have the problem of controlling unfettered access. You're going to want to track the people who do actually have access to kind of the financial data, especially if it lives in your cloud apps that you use for reporting, for finance and accounting purposes. You want to be able to track those people, and you want to be able to see when they actually edit something, delete something, change something, when they access a record, because this is all goes into the compliance side of things, especially when you want to feed this information to third-party auditors. And so this is doing it across all cloud apps, not just, say, the example that I gave, Office 365. And so for requirement 5, it's finding sensitive data tied to an activity or stored in an app, and then placing controls on them. For this one, it's all about what you have sanctioned. So are people uploading PII or PHI or PCI data, source code data into the cloud when they're not supposed to? This also applies back to specifically your company and what policies that you have surrounding the sensitive data and the corporate information that people are using with cloud apps. So being able to actually identify, oh, someone is uploading social security numbers into Box, and they're not actually allowed to do that. Making sure that policies are set in place to prevent this from happening or to remediate it immediately. And this also applies to data that's already resident in the cloud apps, in your sanctioned apps. So whether this be Google Drive, OneDrive, Box, Dropbox, etc., you want to be able to find the information. If it's already uploaded in there, find it and actually protect it. So this includes, do you want to encrypt the information with your own keys? Do you want to, yes, question. Okay, do you want to encrypt this information with your own keys? Do you want to quarantine it, or do you want to put it on legal hold to make sure that the information is appropriate and that can stay in the cloud. And you want the visibility of seeing, okay, so if this is social security numbers in the cloud, who's it being shared with? And be able to actually restrict the sharing, because you'd actually be surprised by the number of people who actually upload this kind of information in the cloud and just have it publicly available for people. Take a question? Yep. And so this obviously ties back to what solution you have to do so. There are a variety of different solutions where you can actually tag a document and tag an email saying it's confidential, super confidential, or just public. Or if you're talking about kind of how to identify this data, it depends on kind of the implementation. So this, for us, it's through kind of a forward or reverse proxy. You can actually identify when someone is actually uploading the data in real time. And it goes through our cloud service to identify the data and make sure that, oh, okay, so this isn't PII, or if this is PII, let's take action on it. And with the data stored in cloud apps already, that's through API connectors. And so a lot of these sanction apps like Microsoft Office 365, Google Drive, etc., the more enterprise-ready ones have APIs for third-party vendors to use to actually use their products to identify this data and perform actions on them. Yep. Yeah, for unsanctioned applications, it would be for a proxy. Yeah. And obviously, you're not going to catch all traffic if it's just using proxies and on-premises. So in the end, it depends on how much coverage you want and what your use case is, but you're also going to have to roll out clients. So agents for kind of the mobile devices and for when people are actually remote and using devices off-premises. Okay, so requirement 6 is enforce policies by source and destination country. And especially for kind of multinational firms, global organizations with a lot of people, this is going to be really important. And this kind of goes back to the contextual and granular policies part of things. Each region, each area, each country is going to have their different set of rules, compliance regimens, etc. to abide by. And so making sure that you can actually cater each of your policies per region and have the documentation to support it is really important. One of the big examples that I give for this is tied into privacy, which is in Europe right now. The General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, was just recently passed. And so for those of us who have a presence in Europe, that's all about data privacy and personal data of its citizens. And that's going to be a really big part of whatever compliance regimen and security policies that you have in place. Their rules are a lot stricter than those in the US, say. And so you're going to have to do things like, okay, ignore the traffic from personal to personal cloud apps and only do corporate ones. Make sure you encrypt the data so that you're protecting the user, and make sure you kind of sign when you're doing your vendor assurance, sign those agreements with cloud app vendors and have those contracts in place so that you know what they're using in terms of the employee's data, how they're using it, and if it's necessary. Because one of the big rules is obviously it has to be necessary for you to take the personal data, for cloud vendors to take the personal data of kind of EU citizens. And so this is going to be a really big part of it. And besides that, it's kind of just protecting the data. And so being able to identify source and destination country is going to be a really big deal when you're dealing with kind of global security policies. All right, last requirement. Requirement 7 is don't leave users in the dark. Coach them on safe usage. And this goes back to the privacy by design principles on kind of openness and transparency and making sure your users know. So allow them, when they're doing an action and you block it or you have the security in place that prevents that from happening, pretty much justify it. Allow them to justify it themselves. Send them a custom message being like, oh, okay, so you're uploading something to this application, but actually the preferred application that we're using for corporate sanction apps is this separate application. And so it's kind of just letting them know what's going on, keeping them up to date, and kind of keeping the transparency and openness so that, they're involved in all the security policies and you actually gain their acceptance and they understand what's happening. So kind of to review the 7 different things that I went over: finding all the cloud apps, understanding the usage, granularly placing your policies so that, it applies to the specific region, the specific context, as well as enforcing the policies by the destination and source country. And finally, coach the users. And so that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to take any questions. Yeah, so that's kind of the discovery process at the very beginning that I mentioned. You can actually look at how many people are using it and make your decisions based off that, right? You can see the enterprise readiness of it and then see how many users are using it. A lot of times we have customers at Netscope where they're kind of using us for vendor assurance. So how many people are using apps in this category? Which apps are they using and which are the most popular? And then you kind of decide on one, sign an agreement with that app that you decide that, the most number of people are using and is the most enterprise ready. And then what you can do is, as I was saying at the end, coach them to it. And so if they're using a different app, you can actually, when they access it and try and log in or something, you can actually redirect them with a coaching message so that they know. And this kind of ties into a lot of your security process in place anyways with your cloud apps, making sure your users and communicating to them and making sure your users know which apps to use and which apps they might not want to use. And a lot of this can be also tied into your existing system. So if you have single sign-on, etc., offering them that app list of what's available. Anyone else?